The latest from the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. We understand the political phase is finished. The focus is now on the military side. This, of course, is the life and death of the story. Russia's demanding Ukraine cede, that's give away 20% of the eastern Donbass region that Moscow has failed to take by force. Kyiv is not open to this plan. Emerald Maxwell looks at what each side wants.
The US president has given Ukraine and Russia until June to find a settlement. Ahead of their meeting Tuesday, Donald Trump minimized the challenge ahead.
It's going to be very easy. I mean, look, so far, Ukraine better come to the table fast. That's all I'm telling you.
It was a somewhat inauspicious comment, given that Ukraine has committed to talks, as President Zelensky reminded.
Soon we will mark a year of Ukraine's most active diplomacy. We have agreed to all realistic proposals from America, starting with the proposal for an unconditional and long-term ceasefire. Russia rejects this, continues assaults at the front, and strikes on our cities and energy infrastructure.
Progress in past negotiations has been scant, and as Ukrainian and Russian delegations convene in Geneva, land remains the biggest sticking point. That is the almost 20% of Ukrainian land that Russia occupies or covets, including Crimea and parts of the eastern Donbass region seized before the 2022 invasion, which Kyiv has refused to give up for a host of reasons.
The soil are quite rich in critical mineral, but also because it's the heart of Ukrainian history and the strategic positioning. And last point, but certainly not least, it's highly unpopular amongst the Ukrainian population. In this regard, it gives the Ukrainian president kind of a strong political mandate to stick to the Ukrainian position.
The future of Ukraine and Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhia, which is currently under Russian control, is another point of friction. There's also disagreement over the possible role of Western troops in post-war Ukraine to deter another invasion, a Kyiv demand that Moscow has rejected. Russia has said it wants to end the war, but Kyiv insists Moscow's actions, including its relentless strikes, prove otherwise. Zelensky has called for more international pressure on Russia to negotiate. This as Moscow's wartime economic woes are mounting, with oil revenues choked by sanctions dropping to a 5-year low.
Let's have more on the situation in Ukraine. Russia's attacks on Ukraine continuing in spite of these peace talks. 3 people have been injured as a result of nighttime drone hits on by Russian forces on the Ukrainian port of Odessa. 2 men were hospitalized. A woman received assistance on site during a Russian attack on the city of Bushtin in the Ivano-Frankivsk region. Centralized heating and hot water supply were disrupted. This, of course, part of a widespread Russian tactic to try to disrupt energy supply to homes at this, the coldest time of winter in Ukraine. People very much suffering in that. Let's get to a deeper analysis and bring in John Lough, who's head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. John, thanks for being with us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. The talks first. Big divide between the two remains. Is there any likelihood, for instance, that Ukraine will agree to give up land?
No, I don't see any immediate likelihood of that happening. As your report has indicated, the sides remain very far apart. And I think there's really a big question here about whether either Ukraine or Russia at this stage really wants to bring the war to an end. There's an impression that both are putting on a bit of a performance for President Trump engaging in these talks. But on both sides, I don't see any willingness to compromise. President Trump believes that he can put more pressure, I think, on Ukraine than he's prepared to put on Russia. And so the Ukrainians feel vulnerable in this sense because there's always the fear that he's going to turn away, that this window of opportunity, in fact, might close. Trump could cut off intelligence support again to the Ukrainian military. And equally, he could potentially say he's not going to sell any more weaponry to the Europeans who are currently supplying the Ukrainians. I think that's personally a little bit unlikely. But it's clear that he's becoming impatient, and he's put the Ukrainians on notice that he expects to get results from these talks. There may be, of course, more rounds beyond Geneva, but he comes across as a man in a hurry who wants to somehow get this done quickly.
Indeed.
But the fundamental issues are so great that one can't see them being bridged, certainly at this round of negotiations.
Completely hear what you're saying, John, on that one. Trump, of course, keen to do business. That's what he's about. It's all about transaction, regardless of the moral stance that if you stand back and look at it, you can apply to the situation in terms of human justice or even international justice. Clearly. And why should Ukraine have to give up land that is theirs, that an aggressor is trying to take? That aggressor, of course, being Russia. Just spelling that out in case Mr. Trump is watching. Russia's propaganda, John, is always saying one thing about how they're winning, how they're doing well, how it's all being in their favour, how everything is going their way. But is there a point now, John, that the Russian people are starting to feel what the truth of the matter is? The sanctions are starting to bite, and perhaps the propaganda that they're fed isn't as convincing as it has been.
I would dispute that. I think the propaganda is still working extremely well. From what we can understand, there's no desire in the Russian public, en masse, to see this war end on terms that would not be advantageous to Russia. So I think there's still a lot of support to continue the fighting because Putin's led the population to believe that victory is imminent. So he's set certain expectations here, and it's difficult to walk away from them. So I don't think we can rely on any sort of anti-war community within Russia to be raising its head and calling for the war to end. It's true that economic problems are definitely starting to mount up, but Putin feels, and probably correctly, that he can last in this war longer than Ukraine can. And I think it's very significant that he's laying waste to the Ukrainian energy sector. Ukrainians are suffering very badly in the middle of winter right now, and it's going to be very difficult to repair the power system over the coming months. And I think one has to consider here that Ukrainian industry is also being badly hit by this. I'm certainly aware of one major industrial producer just having to stop production completely because of the problems with power supply. So the problems, I think, are mounting up on both sides because the Russians are not achieving this level of military advance that they're promising the whole time. They're not breaking through Ukrainian lines in a significant way. And I think if you zoom out, you can really see that there's something of perhaps a relatively stable front line overall. The Russians are advancing, but at a snail's pace. And I think this explains why they've resorted to, in fact, attacking the civilian population and really trying to destroy the critical energy infrastructure in Ukraine. So that's an indication they're not doing so well.
Indeed. Volodymyr Zelensky talking about an unconditional long-term ceasefire is what he'd like to see. He says Putin's got no intention of going for that. I think that's a fair assumption to make. The situation on the ground, though, and you've been alluding to this, John, in your previous answer, for ordinary Ukrainians is getting more and more difficult with the breaking down of the home comforts. That's a very cozy way to put it, but it is in the temperatures that we're talking about, -20 and even colder, a matter of life and death for many people. Add to that the fact they can't feed themselves properly, they can't access the kind of drinking water that they should be getting access to. Are those problems, do you think, going to weigh as much on these talks, on these discussions as they go forward, as any other military question?
Well, I think negotiations always take place in a context, and this context has changed over the last few months because Ukraine's position in this respect has deteriorated, as the Russians have really gone about systematically destroying Ukraine's critical infrastructure. So that has to surely weigh on the minds of those people at the negotiating table, and indeed for President Zelensky, he's got to make a calculation here. His big hope is that he can persuade the Americans to provide a credible security guarantee that would allow him technically, I think, to agree to at least not the abandonment of territory in the Donbass region, but it being converted into a territory which might be described, I think in his language, as a special economic zone or something of that kind, where the Ukrainians might withdraw some of their forces, and you could envisage a situation there where the Ukrainians believe they have the support of their allies, and notably the United States, to prevent any further Russian aggression. The trouble is the Russians reject this approach and want to ensure that there are no, for example, foreign troops on Ukraine's territory. The size of the Ukrainian military is limited, and that they can very probably, once they've recovered from the impact this war's had on them, that they can move further into Ukraine at some point. So they are, I think, prepared to play the long game. And that is a big problem strategically for Ukraine.
Indeed. John Lough, thank you very much indeed for being with us and bringing your clarity to the situation. It's much appreciated. John Lough, the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Pleasure talking with you.